But I got a phone call. I got somebody calling. Are you there?
Yeah.
I guess I led you in, and I'm asking you if you're one of our new Daniels in the world. This is Chris Marola.
I don't know if I'm a Daniel. I do know this. As Christians living in these times, we're going to have to take a hit for speaking up and doing what's right, much like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, much like Daniel, much like people in the New Testament as well. It costs you something in today's world to speak up for truth and morality.
Right. Exactly. You're exactly right, Chris, because the things that are going on right now, me and you spoke about some things in the last couple of weeks. Actually, Chris is one of my mentors. I'll tell everybody that. He helps me a lot with different things, but the crisis at the border right now that's going on, we got problems. I mean, my heart's open to all these people that are coming across. We need to figure out how to handle this in a much better way than it's being handled right now, for sure.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. I'll be honest, on air, I didn't know I was your mentor, but I appreciate it. I just thought I was a friend, so I appreciate that my friendship has an influence on you that way. I wasn't aware of that, so thank you for telling me that.
Yeah. Well, you've straightened me out several times already.
I didn't know you needed straightened out. I was just shooting straight and telling the truth. Here's what we have in America today. Every problem, socially and culturally, can boil down to one category of problems. It's called moral relativism. And it's the idea that you and I, as individual people, can choose what we call truth and what we call morality. And once you start choosing subjectively to make up your own truth and your own morality, well, then what happens? The culture begins to fall apart because the culture isn't following a consistent worldview. And so the danger of moral relativism is every single person, we have 330 million people in America, creates their own morality, their own truth. Well, then that just creates chaos. And so there used to be a time in America when the majority of people, maybe not everyone, but a majority, believed that truth and morality were concrete, objective, fixed, and absolute. Today, we've been taught that truth and morality are fluid. They're always changing. They're subjective. They're based on how we feel. I mean, that's a recipe for disaster, and that's where our culture is today. Would you not agree?
I do agree, and that's part of the problem with the cancer culture, and the problem with the way our kids are being taught in school, because there's no set discipline going forward. It's like if somebody comes up with this new how do you want to say curriculum, that this is the way it should be taught, then they deviate from where they should have been, and finally we've deviated so much from the truth and teaching our kids the right way that now we don't even teach civics in school no more. I mean, there's no. I mean, we don't say a prayer in school. We don't. I mean, I think we need to have prayer in school back again. People need or a moment of silence so everybody can pray to whoever they want or whatever they want. That's part of America.
It is, and see, here's the thing: when we're going back about 100 years. Where America, and this is my opinion, and I think it can be verified through history fairly well, the progressive era that began in the early 1900s, we're looking about 110 years ago or so. The progressive era brought in some legitimate reforms, like getting rid of child labor and, getting rid of the abuse of people in work. There were some legitimate reforms that came out of the progressive movement. But also, see, here you go again. Once you stop believing truth and morality are set in stone and fixed and concrete and absolute, then you can do anything. And so they weren't happy enough, the progressives of about 110 years ago, to just do some reform. Then they started radically changing America. For instance, Woodrow Wilson was the first progressive Democrat president. He was elected in 1912. And here's the thing about Wilson. He wouldn't have been elected if Teddy Roosevelt had not run on a third-party ticket. He took enough votes away from the Republican President Taft to allow Wilson to squeak through. Wilson was a big progressive and had some wacko ideas. First of all, he was racist. He wrote a 5-volume set on the history of America, according to himself, of course. So see, there's the subjective, not the facts, not the truth, not the absolute truth that never changes, his opinion on how America came into being. And in that 5-volume set, he made every black man and black woman look like they were criminals. And if it wasn't for, his understanding of what he believed white people were to be, then America would not be what it was. So it's a very racist 5-volume set. He was, I think he was the dean of Princeton University. He wrote this 5-volume set of his interpretation of history. He's very racist. It was a very racist, compilation of his opinion of history.
But this, Chris, I hate to jump in here, but this is indicative of the Democrat Party. I mean, throughout history, they've always been extremely racist organization. And I just recently came across something this past week where we saw the logo that they used to use, of course, is now the donkey. But what they used to use was a rooster, and at the bottom it said Democrat Party. And at the top, it said white supremacy. Have you ever seen this image?
Well, you would be talking about the Southern Democrats. We have to make the distinction because the Southern Democrats were very racist. There's no doubt about it. The Northern Democrats, not so much. So we don't want to lump the two together.
They still didn't vote for civil rights. Up into the 60s, the Northern Democrats didn't want civil rights.
Well, that's a fair point. Let me say this. Okay. The Democrat Party came together in the 1820s. And in 1828 was the first presidential election of the first Democrat president, and that was Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson was a racist, and he was very much in favor of slavery, which is why, believe it or not, this is what history shows us, the Democrat Party was formed in the 1820s, and they ran Andrew Jackson for the purpose of advancing slavery. That's just a fact. What Andrew Jackson is known for is genocide. Here's what he did. Have you ever heard of the Trail of Tears?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah. That's the Cherokees.
Yeah. What he did, Woodrow Wilson, is so appalling, and you never hear about it in history. It's not blamed on him when it should be. It was his order. He gave the order to have Native Americans living in Georgia and Louisiana. He forced them to walk all the way to Oklahoma. And 16,000 Native Americans, men, women, and children, elderly as well, walked from Georgia and Louisiana to Louisiana. It was more than 16,000, but 16,000 died, is what I should say.
Yeah.
So there were tens of thousands that walked, but 16,000 Native Americans, men, women, children, elderly, died walking all the way from Georgia and Louisiana to Oklahoma. He wanted them off their land because he found gold, and he wanted the gold. And so that is the first president of the Democrat Party. And the South, the Southern Democrats absolutely have a history in racism. The KKK was started by Southern Democrats.
Sure.
So now let's fast forward now to Wilson. He writes this racist 5-volume set with a distorted interpretation of history. See, there's moral relativism. Mm-hmm. Truth isn't what it is, it's what he wants it to be. That 5-volume set was picked up by the KKK. They created a film based on Wilson's 5-volume set of racist history and made a film out of it, a propaganda film called The Birth of a Nation. Right. And it shows, again, it shows black men and women being criminals, and the KKK comes in and, saves the day, so to speak, according to the Klan. They actually showed that film in the White House to Wilson, and he stood up and gave it a standing ovation.
Right.
How about that?
It's like I said, it seems indicative of the Democrat Party. I mean, even if you look in today's standards of how they've treated the African American community, and we get one president like President Trump who comes in here and raises not just the African American community out of poverty, but we're talking about the Latino community, the Asian community, all of these groups of people who we've seems like we've all divided as a country. But if you want to separate them into the divided, states of America as the Democrats have, you can see what Trump did by bringing all of these people into a better place. I mean, through the highest level of unemployment in history. And that's where I can't help but think that Democrat policies over the decades, even into our 21st century, have been fairly racist policies towards the people who tend to vote in their blocks for these for that organization.
It depends on the president. Yeah, it depends on the president. JFK was not racist. Truman was not racist. But FDR, believe it or not, who is lauded as a Democrat hero,
right,
he was racist when who was Jesse Owens? When Jesse Owens, the black American athlete, won gold multiple times in Germany in the Olympics in 1936, the Republicans in Congress welcomed him to the Congress, and they gave him a standing ovation in Congress for what he did. FDR refused to meet Jesse Owens in the White House for fear of offending the Southern Democrats.
Wow.
Because they knew a black man being lauded by the president would harm his reputation with the Southern Democrats in the 1936 era. So he was kind of racist as well. Certainly we mentioned Woodrow Wilson, and of course we mentioned Andrew Jackson. Now juxtapose that with
Abraham Lincoln. Right?
Yes, the first Republican president versus the first Democrat president. He's the one that forced Congress to pass the 13th Amendment to end slavery. They didn't want to take up the 13th Amendment. This Civil War had just ended. I mean, within like the first month or two, after, maybe even a month after the Civil War ended, he immediately said, we got to get this done. We have to end this slavery. It's tearing apart America. He twisted arms. And if you've ever seen the movie Lincoln,
I've read the book. Beautiful. Beautiful story. He was, even the book explains, that even though that his father and himself didn't get along for, for the most of their lives, that they were both adamantly against racism. Even, Lincoln, you could go all the way back to when he was 5 or 6 years old. And that's the birth of what we believed in then as Republicans. That's what an abolitionist movement is how the GOP came of that, and that's how I feel like we've maintained, like I said, through the civil rights, things like that, to what Trump's done today. We've always just been America first, and
Well, I would agree. And there's been bad Republicans too. Herbert Hoover was terrible. Richard Nixon was horrible. But in general, the Republican Party has been more about treating people based on their character and what can you bring to this country, not on their color of skin or this demographic over here, where the Democrats have, for some reason, been absorbed with this demographic, your race, your gender, your class, your race, your gender, your class, instead of seeing people as individuals. So if you look at it, there's always exceptions. Like I said, JFK was a good Democrat. Truman was too. There have been good Democrats, but the history of the Southern Democratic Party specifically has been about racism. And here we are today, and it seems like they haven't learned the lesson of history because they continue to classify people based on race, gender, and class instead of seeing people as individuals. And, Martin Luther King was a Republican. Did you know that?
I did know that. Yes, I did.
I did know that.
Yeah. His niece, who is a strong conservative Republican, she speaks out on pro-life issues. Elvita Scott King.
Yeah.
She, is Elvita? It's Elvita King. I think her middle name is, it's not, maybe I'm thinking Scott was Martin Luther King's wife's middle name. Anyway, Elvita King is someone who speaks out. She's a conservative. And she said her uncle, Martin Luther King, was a Republican. And so was Jesse Owens. So was Jackie Robinson, who broke the color barrier, because the Republican Party had been the party of liberation going back to slavery, bringing an end to Jim Crow and all these other policies. When the 1964 Civil Rights Act came before the Congress, okay, this was to end segregation nationally. Do you know the Democrats, the Southern Democrats, actually filibustered in the Senate to stop the bill that would end segregation? Did you know that?
I do know that. And because quite often today you get a lot of, millennials and Gen Z who's taught in their liberal arts class that, that the Southern solution was the switch between the parties. And I have to go back and point to them and say, hey, one senator, one congressman came over. That actually, if you look at the Southern solution, it didn't work. Jimmy Carter was elected, in the 70s under what they consider the switch.
Right. Yeah.
It's not true.
So was LBJ. Was LBJ.
Right.
The switch in the parties happened not in 1960s, like they said. The switch in the party happened in the 1994 Republican Revolution, when the Republicans picked up, 56 congressional seats. What happened was Bill Clinton, people don't remember this, his first 2 years as president were so hardcore left for the time. By today's standard, it'd actually be considered moderate based on the Democrat Party of today. But in the 90s, he was so far left that a lot of the middle ground blue dog, Democrats, the old school JFK Democrats, like my parents who used to be JFK Democrats, they became Republicans because they saw how far left the Democrat Party had moved. So again, I don't want to throw every Democrat under the bus. There are exceptions to what we're talking about with the Southern Democrats being very, very racist oriented. JFK was certainly one of them. But when 1964 came around and it was time to end segregation, the Southern Democrats, including Al Gore's dad, who was the senator in Tennessee, filibustered. They stayed up all night trying to keep the bill from passing. They wanted to keep segregation legal. And guess how segregation ended? What happened in the U.S. Senate to get the 1964 Civil Rights Act passed? Do you guys know?
What was it?
A Republican senator from Illinois stood up and added multiple amendments to the bill to attract as many Republicans and Democrats to get it over the top. And so the Democrats were in the majority in 64, and yet a greater percentage of Republicans voted to end segregation than the Democrats, and they were in the majority. So the majority party, the Democrat Party, in 64 could not pass the Civil Rights Bill just along party lines. They needed the Republicans to come in. And I think the numbers are 82% of the Republicans voted to end segregation, and only 66% of the Democrats voted to end segregation.
Yeah, somebody just brought up a great point. John, do you want to
go ahead?
No, okay. I was going to say, someone just brought up a great point online. They said that the NRA was actually formed to provide firearms for the African Americans of the South for protection of the time. I didn't know that. That's actually news to me. But these are all organizations, or what you consider conservative today, that have been fighting what the Democrats are now perpetuating as, us as a racist country. And we can go back 50 and 60 years, Chris, and we can look at the Republicans leading the way on, racial equality and just, like you said, removing segregation. These sorts of things the civil rights movement in general was led by Republicans.
Yeah. Specifically, not just Republicans, conservative Christian Republicans started the civil rights movement, leading to the end of slavery. Conservative Christian people led the charge to get rid of segregation. And here's what's interesting. You mentioned all of this about the Republican Party and their history. This goes back to, as you said, Abraham Lincoln. Not only was the NRA started by conservative people to arm freed slaves so they could fight against the KKK, the NRA was started to arm freed slaves to help them fight against the KKK. Not only was that done, but Ulysses S. Grant, president, in what would this be? He was elected 1868. He started the Department of Justice. Why do you think U.S. Grant started the Department of Justice when he was president?
Well, it was to protect the minorities, is what it was, or the Southern. Yeah, that's what it was about. U.S. Grant, when he was president, elected in 1868, started the Department of Justice so that they would go after the KKK and shut them down. Yep. Hey, Chris, I have to take a break. It was great having you here today, and we covered a lot of ground, clear from 1820 to
thanks for all the great history.
Almost the present day. A lot of people doesn't know this, but if they listen to Chris long enough, he is a very knowledgeable historian about our country. So, hey, Chris, we're going to take a break. I'll have you back on again in a short period of time, I'm sure, and we'll talk about some other things.
All right, guys. Thanks again.
Yeah.
Thanks,
take
Chris.
care.
All right. Take care.
Yep.